Welcome back, everyone, and happy Memorial Day. We're going to be reading some stories based on this first story. It's about the American Revolution, but we're going to be reading various stories about our men and women in uniform. So we hope that you stick around with us for our other stories about spring and summer and about new growth and taking bold action together. We hope these stories will inspire you to live boldly, take wise chances, and with our friends and family make a difference together. So our first book is Victory or Death, Stories of the American Revolution by Doreen Rappaport and Joan Verniero, and illustrated by Greg Call. So go ahead and lean in with the spirit of adventure, grab a friend, and let's enjoy the story together. All right, now these are difficult subjects. That it was a difficult time for everyone involved, so hang in there. These are good stories and it's important to know, but these are difficult circumstances. So let's get into it with the soldier with the pen, Peter Brown. In April 1775, the Continental Congress in Philadelphia was still debating whether or not to separate from England. Despite the recent battles at Lexington and Concord, many delegates hoped for a peaceful solution. But even those who were certain about independence saw the need for well-equipped, trained troops, for which we really didn't have any. On June 15, 1775, the delegates elected George Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. Before he could get to Boston, the Americans learned that the British planned to fortify the Dorchester Heights Peninsula south of Boston in order to control the entrance by sea. They planned to sail across the harbor and attack the American army camped at Cambridge. On the evening of June 16, 1775, the Americans moved first to fortify Bunker Hill across the bay on the Charleston Peninsula. Originally, it was called Charlestown, spelled anyway, peninsula, but Charleston. Peter Brown lifted his pick high off the ground. His arms ached. He had been digging in the dark for almost 5 hours. Can you imagine the kind of blisters that you would have? Blisters on blisters. And yeah, I mean, obviously their hands would be calloused, but 5 hours. How many more rocks more rocks were there to move on this steep-sided hill? The 20-year-old corporal grumbled as he hit more rubble. He stopped to wipe his brow with his bare arm, then swung his pick again. Like many soldiers here, Brown had fought at Lexington and Concord. He had planned to work this summer in Connecticut, but joined the militia instead. He signed on as a corporal to do the duties of clerk and orderly or messenger. Brown hadn't even had time to write his mother to tell her. If he survived this, he would write her. Lovely. He touched the quill pen in his pants pocket as if to make the promise. Since midnight, Brown and 900 other soldiers in Colonel William Prescott's regiment had chipped away at earth and stone to build a fort on Breeze's Hill. Breeze's Hill was a perfect place for a fort. It was 75 feet high with a wide view of the area around Boston, including the harbor where the British ships were anchored. The half-completed fort was a rough square. Its 6-foot-high walls were 130 feet long on each side, packed with dirt, wood, and sticks. Brown felt confident that British cannonballs would not be able to penetrate these strong walls. He was still digging just before sunrise when he heard the booms and crashes of cannon fire from the British ships in the harbor. Obviously, Redcoat on watch had spotted the fort. Brown ducked behind the wall. Men digging outside the fort hurried inside and aimed their flintlock muskets. Colonel Prescott shouted to his troops to hold their fire. They were too high up for their muskets to be effective. So you have to remember that muskets were wildly ineffectual. I mean, they had what they had, but not only did it take, 16 steps, I believe, to fully shoot a musket. So you got to put padding in, you got to press it down, you got to put the bullet, which doesn't look like our modern bullets, in there. I mean, it was a process, and you had one shot. So if you can imagine doing all of that, someone's charging towards you, that is a stressful prospect with just that one shot. So, and they were also really, really difficult to aim because our bullets are shaped to be more pointed on the end. These are round, like a cannonball. So they're whooshing around, not in a straight direct line. So you couldn't aim at what you were aiming at. You had to aim a little bit lower, and then that's not counting the wind and all of the other factors. So, So you had to be real close, especially with our muskets at the time and our equipment, which wasn't much. Yeah, so you had to wait a bit, which would have been incredibly stressful. The British cannons roared. Brown's ears rang with the sound of the cannonade. So remember the ships. Okay, so Bunker Hill. So Bunker Hill's up here, and then the field they're working in is down here, Breed's Hill. And then down below are where the ships that the very well-equipped British redcoats are coming in. So they have cannons on the ships, and they're shooting up at the fort. The fort trembled, but the few cannonballs that hit high enough on the hill did not penetrate the walls. Still, they did scorch the earth and choke the air with smoke. Brown could hardly breathe. How long would this bombardment last? He waited impatiently until it stopped. When it did, his head still swirled from the terrible noise. Yeah, those things are loud. We visited some forts, and they've done some practice shooting with those cannons, and it is incredibly loud. And then it's going to reverberate, too, because of the being on the water. So, yeah, it can be loud. Let's see. The cannon silent, Colonel Prescott ordered his men back to digging. Make the trenches deeper, he commanded, and pack more earth on the walls. He assigned some soldiers to build wooden platforms for the cannons that would soon arrive from headquarters in Cambridge. Again, Brown chipped away at the earth. It was only 5 o'clock in the morning, but the day was already unseasonably hot. There wasn't a cloud in the sky. Half an hour passed. So remember, Boston, so it's humid as well. The men building the platforms demanded to know why the cannons hadn't arrived yet from Cambridge. How could they protect themselves without them? Prescott ignored their complaints and told them to work harder. The bombing started again. Brown barely heard Prescott's commands over the roar of the British cannons. In the light of day, he saw that the regiment's only water keg and 2 kegs of rum lay on the grassy hillside. So, also, at that time, water was pretty dangerous. There were a lot of, things floating around in it. So, alcohol was used as a way to stay safe when drinking liquid. It wasn't the same as it was now. As I understand, it was more watered down, so to speak. But yeah, so I'm surprised, honestly, that they even had water. But yeah, the regiment's only water keg and 2 kegs of rum lay on the grassy hillside. Before Prescott gave the order to move them into the fort, a British cannonball hit the water keg. Not good. The precious liquid spilled onto the grass. A few soldiers sprang to their feet to bring the rum inside. Several took hearty swigs of the liquor as if it were their last drink, and it probably was. There was more grumbling as the hours passed. By 8 o'clock, the men were still complaining, mostly about their parched throats. A few soldiers volunteered to go down to the village of Charleston and return with water. Asa Pollard from Billerica, Massachusetts, took the lead, running down the hill. Now, it's about to get a bit graphic. So, this is a story with the most graphic aspects. If that's not something that you want to listen to, come back from the next story, or wait about, paragraph or so. But this is the reality of what it was like, so it's important for us to learn about it. Okay. So Asa took the lead, running down the hill. Brown watched in horror as a cannonball exploded near Pollard. Blood coated the grass where Pollard fell. Brown's throat tightened from shock. The young farmer's body lay strewn in parts all over the grass. Pollard was only 14 years old. Other soldiers shouted out in response to the hideous death. Some jumped up on the parapet on top of the wall fixed on Pollard's dead body. "Get down," Colonel Prescott ordered. The British cannons roared again. The men kept shouting, "Where are the fresh troops to relieve us?" Scores of men ran for Bunker, the highest hill in the northwest, only 500 yards away. Brown expected Colonel Prescott to call them back, but he never did. More and more Americans fell wounded on the hill. Prescott shouted to his men to come to order. Some argued defiantly that Asa Pollard deserved a proper burial. Finally, Prescott ordered a grave to be dug. Brown watched the men feverishly dig in the far side of the hill, as far away from the British cannonballs as they could get. And that's very unusual. So I'm assuming, if this is completely accurate, that he had a special place in their heart, not just because he was young or just, that, yeah. I mean, that was risky for everyone involved. Then, as if to quiet the troops and show them they had nothing to fear, Prescott scaled the wall. He removed his wig and cocked hat and brandished his sword at the British ships below. An hour later, the troops had calmed down, and Pollard was buried, but the grumbling didn't stop. A few officers approached Prescott. The commander asked Brown to take notes on their conversation. One officer insisted that the men needed immediate relief. He stressed that they were too tired and hungry to continue. Trying to quiet them, Prescott insisted that the British would not attack the fort. Out of the corner of his eye, Brown saw men sneaking away to Bunker Hill. So, again, the more fortified, the much safer position than the hill that most of the others were on. The desertions continued. By 10 o'clock, Brown counted no more than 500 men in the fort. Prescott ordered a 330-foot-long wall built to further protect the northeast end of the fort. Make it as high as your chests, he instructed. Peter Brown dug and packed earth under a relentless sun. He tried not to think about the heat or his dry throat. He was one of the lucky ones. At least he had his hat with a large brim to protect him from the sun's glare. Finally, the cannons arrived, pulled by horses. The soldiers immediately protested. Why were there only 4 cannons? Why had they sent 4-pounders, the smallest of the big guns? Who was responsible for such a stupid mistake? So, again, the reality of the situation was we were very much not prepared for this. We were outgunned and outmanned in every possible scenario and compared to the British Army. So the fact that they got 4 is honestly kind of a miracle. And you got to remember, too, that it's not like they could just send it on a truck or the railroad. They were dragging this behind horses. So, it took a long time. Cannons are heavy. And even they're calling it 4-pounders, but it's a cannon. It's still very heavy. All right, so I just wanted to check on something because I always want to give you the proper information, the truth. So I wanted to know that when they call it a 4-pounder, the cannonball itself, that's 4 pounds, but I wasn't sure how much the cannon itself weighed. And apparently it was 637 pounds, not counting the cannonball. And that was about the average of 4 of the typical soldier for the time. So 4 soldiers equaled just the cannon parts of the cannon. And I looked up also, so they were coming from Cambridge, Massachusetts, and they're Bunker Hill, Boston. That's about only 3 miles. Again, you've got, 4 of these cannons, and among other things, a horse is hauling it. 3 miles feels very long. Also, the steps in order to shoot a musket is 12. So I just want to check on that, which is still a lot of steps, especially when someone's coming at you. So anyway, let's get back to reading. Okay, so they're complaining again. And so they're saying, who's responsible for this stupid mistake? Again, very little supplies. So most likely not a mistake. Most likely just trying to figure out where the best uses of resources are and the money. So anyway, complaining. All right, which doesn't help anything. Okay, a sentry told Prescott soldiers from New Hampshire and Connecticut were building defenses on the beach behind a stone wall and a rail fence. If the British marched across the beach, the Americans would be hidden away, ready to shoot. Brown felt slightly comforted since he knew the New Hampshire soldiers were extraordinary marksmen. At noon, the British cannons grew silent. Brown looked down and saw why. 28 big barges were crossing the half-mile distance from Boston to the peninsula. Rows and rows of men in red uniforms were seated in the boats. To protect the redcoat troops, a large British men of war anchored in the harbor started firing again at the hill, so to give cover fire for the soldiers that are getting off the boats. Brown estimated there were more than 2,000 soldiers. The redcoats were properly named for their tight crimson waistcoats. He thought, how could they bear those high, stiff collars in this heat? How could they move with sleeves as tight as stockings? Their uniform pants and gaiters up to their calves were just as tight. Brown didn't have a uniform. In fact, none of the Americans but Colonel Prescott had one. And in the heat of the day, he had removed his coat. Brown watched the British strut across the beach. How well equipped they were with bayonets, scabbards, rifles, and muskets. Square cartridge boxes hung at their right hips. Brown only had a musket. So did most of the other men. Muskets were so clumsy to use. It took 16. Oh, see, they say 16. Well, anyway. A quick search said 12, but this says 16. So somewhere like that. It took 16 separate motions to load them. And for all that work, a musket's shot was inaccurate. You had to aim lower than your mark. You also had to account for the wobble of the lead ball once it left the barrel. Brown had very little ammunition. No American had more than 10 rounds of gunpowder and lead. A third of a mile away, he saw the redcoats walking towards Morton's Hill. Gold glittered on the necks of the officers. The gold crescents, called gorgets, caught the sun's reflection. Their shiny ornaments made perfect targets, Brown thought. Let them climb our hill, the closer the better. But the British didn't climb. They sat down and took out food from their packs. They were stopping for lunch, a little picnic. How arrogant they are, Brown thought. In the temporary quiet, Prescott ordered more wounded moved to Bunker Hill. More than were needed to volunteer to do the job. Brown knew they would not return. Prescott said nothing as his men hurriedly took away the wounded. Brown had no intention of deserting. His gaze was fixed on the redcoats. After lunch, they packed up. Straight and strong of step, they began marching confidently up the short hill. Soon they weren't as confident, as many tripped over parts of fences, kilns, and clay pits invisible to the waist-high grass. Walking through swampy patches in the grass slowed them down, too. As they fell upon their comrades, their lines were no longer straight and orderly. Their heavy sacks and weapons made getting up difficult. Closer, closer. They were marching directly towards the marksmen, hidden behind the stone wall on the beach. The crooked first line of redcoats was 100 or so paces away from them. Suddenly there was a burst of patriot fire, second burst, a third. Brown had heard the stories about how skillful these New Hampshire men were, but he was still amazed how quickly and accurately they fired. The 4-pounders fired too, the cannons, and helped push back the British. Then the platform collapsed and they were quiet. Brown looked down and cheered as he saw the beach was now strewn with the bodies of British officers. Other soldiers snickered as British soldiers fled in disorder, but Brown knew that didn't mean they were surrendering. It was strangely silent when they regrouped. A second wave of redcoats started down the beach. This time they walked in columns 10 men deep. When they came into close enough range, the sharpshooters fired. Brown saw blurs of red as British soldiers fell. Now far fewer gorgets caught the sun's reflection, but the British weren't without their own strategy. He saw some redcoats had changed direction. They turned to climb Breeze's Hill from the southeast, digging heels into the sloped earth for better footing. Prescott moved about the fort, urging his men not to shoot until the enemy was closer. When the British were 60 yards away, he gave the order to fire, but their musket balls and powder could not reach the enemy. "Hold your fire," he shouted. Perspiration tingled in Brown's pores. The enemy was now only 20 yards away. "Fire!" William Prescott bellowed. From every direction, powder exploded and lead blasted upon the British. They scrambled down the hill. Some fired back as they ran. Brown heard moaning and shouting about him as British soldiers hit their targets. Through the smoke and dust, he saw more men in his regiment fleeing for the safety of Bunker Hill. Then suddenly from the south, the sky was red with leaping flames. The British men of war had a new target. They were bombing the village of Charleston. The church steeple was a pyramid of fire, and buildings fell together in ruins. Only one round left. William Prescott's shirt was covered in dust like the rest of the soldiers. The Americans readied for a third British advance. They gathered twigs, rocks, and pieces of glass to use as gunshot. Peter Brown did a quick head count. Only 150 men were left in the fort. Some were too wounded to fight, yet he took heart. Twice they had repelled the mighty British army. Surely they could do it a third time. Below, 2 more British regiments marched along the beach. The marksmen hit the soldiers in the front. A column of redcoats started climbing the hill from the southeast. A third group ascended from the southwest side. Now they were moving quickly, for they had thrown off their waistcoats and packs and carried only bayonets. Brown saw their 14-inch blades raised to attack. He ripped the cartridge paper with his teeth and poured powder into his musket. He heard the lead ball plunk down with it. Then he fired his last round of ammunition. The enemy fell back temporarily as more Americans hit their targets. Another wave of redcoats started marching towards the fort. The smoke around them made it hard to see where to fire. Brown loaded his musket with twigs. The man next to him stuffed rocks and dirt into his. The British were close, mere feet away. Now they were in the trench. In a minute they would climb over the fort walls. Brown noticed Peter Salem, a free Negro from Framingham, raising his gun to shoot. Through air that was clouded from cannon fire, gunshot, and blood, Brown followed the line of Salem's aim to British Major Pitcairn. It was Pitcairn's men who had opened fire upon the people of Lexington. With his last bit of lead and powder, Peter Salem felled Major John Pitcairn. The British stormed over the parapet and from the rear of the fort, pointing their bayonets at everyone in the path. Brown stuck out with the butt of his musket. Others used rocks in their fists, and there were too many redcoats. They couldn't keep them off the wall or push them back into the trench. "Retreat!" ordered William Prescott. There was a flurry of feet and hands as the men scrabbled through the opening to the fort and down the north side of Breeze's Hill. Soldiers who had deserted on Bunker Hill ran to join them. Brown did not look back at the fort, but he knew that everyone had gotten away. Some were trapped, but he knew not everyone had gotten away. Some were trapped by the enemy's bayonets. It was hard not tripping over the powder horns, water bottles, sacks, and bloodied British bodies that were nearly invisible to the high grass. The sharpshooters on the beach provided cover as they struggled to hurdle stone walls. The 2.5-hour battle was over. William Prescott led his men back to the camp in Cambridge. The British had taken Breeze's Hill, but Peter Brown was not alone in feeling that they had won a victory. Their small, untrained volunteer army had shown the British that they were willing to fight. 8 days later, Peter Brown wrote to his mother about the battle. "Oh, may I never forget God's distinguishing mercy to me in sparing my life. If we should ever be called again to action, I hope to have courage and the strength to act my part." This battle on June 17, 1775 was recorded in the historical records as the Battle of Bunker Hill. The reasons were twofold. First, the defensive plan had been to fortify Bunker Hill. Upon arriving there, Prescott's officer suggested that Breeze's Hill was preferable because it was closer to Boston than Bunker, and that American light cannons could not reach the city or harbor from as high as the top of the taller Bunker Hill. Second reason was that most of the Americans spent the battle on Bunker Hill. When they returned home, they told stories of how they fought on Bunker. Very few mentioned the action really took place on Breeze's Hill. Those who deserted to Bunker Hill did not tell their families. Peter Brown's letter to his mother was one of the most detailed eyewitness records of the Battle of Bunker Hill. Brown, along with Peter Salem, fought with the Continental Army until the war ended, which is amazing. While the Patriots did not stop the British from taking the peninsula of Charleston, they killed and wounded more than 1,000 British soldiers. The British lost 40% of their men to death or injury, including officers. More than 150 American soldiers died, and nearly 300 Americans were wounded or captured. After this battle, many more Americans favored independence. They were proud of how their soldiers had stood up to the mighty British Army. 2 weeks later, on July 2, 1775, George Washington arrived in Cambridge to lead the Continental Army. The colonies moved one step closer to war with England. And that does it for this chapter, and we hope to see you for the next one.